Paper was like gold in medieval times.
Oh, not tobacco, sugar.
That everything we thought we knew about the world might turn out to be completely wrong.
Nelson Mandela's first glimpse of Johannesburg was at night from a car. After giving up on the train, he and Justice managed to hitch a lift from the Transkei, ironically with a white woman. She kept a close eye on them in her rearview mirror. The city of gold showed its glamorous side as they drove by, but the metropolitan sophistication was for whites only. Black people were there to make life easier. It was 1941. South Africa was fighting on the side of the Allies against Nazi Germany. The war was creating a boom. Despite efforts to limit the influx of blacks from the rural areas, there was an increased demand for labour. Mandela and Justice found work at Crown Mines. Mandela as a night watchman, and Justice, because he was the son of the Tembu Regent, as a clerk. Looking more like management than a worker, this is the only known picture of Mandela at the time he was at Crown Mines.
The gold mines were at the centre of Johannesburg's economy. Most of the rural workers arriving in this city gravitated to them. Crown Mines was the largest gold mine, but for Mandela there was nothing magical about the place. But it did mean a much-needed job.
After long hours underground, the mine workers were cooped up in cramped barracks. This old hostel in Newtown, Johannesburg, now the Workers' Museum, has the kind of concrete bunks that made it difficult to get a good night's sleep. Mandela would have sensed the anger of his fellow mine workers about their poor conditions and derisory wages. But new to the city, and in a new job, he steered clear of politics. He and Justice were soon in trouble, though. After boasting about leaving the Transkei without the blessing of the Regent, they were thrown off Crown Mines. With things suddenly looking bleak, Mandela was put in touch with a man who was able to pull a few strings for him. Walter Sisulu juggled business with politics. He was a busy estate agent who was becoming increasingly active in the African National Congress.
It was very difficult, if not impossible, for black people to rent office space in the Johannesburg city centre. But after a long battle with the authorities, Walter Sisulu was given permission to set up shop in that building over there. He had a well-established network of contacts, and many young, ambitious black people newly arrived in the city would come here for his advice. Nelson Mandela was among them.
When Walter Sisulu met his wife-to-be, Albertina, he and Mandela were firm friends. They were so close, Albertina initially thought Mandela was a relative.
He is from a great home in the Transkei. And Walter knew some of those old people there. So that's why I think he was so friendly to him, to teach him whatever he wants him to know in Johannesburg.
The Sisulus were impressed that Mandela wanted to finish his studies, even contemplating law. But he didn't give much else away at the time.
Nelson was just a student, and we didn't even know how far he's going to go with his education. What is he going to be? So we didn't know anything more than he was a young boy then.
These two men also helped Mandela find his feet in Johannesburg, something he'd never forget, as this picture shows. Lazar Sadelsky, on the right, was the lawyer who employed Mandela as a clerk on Walter Sisulu's recommendation. On the left is Nat Bregman, Sadelsky's cousin. He did articles at the law firm with Mandela. Their desks were side by side. Bregman was a member of the Communist Party and introduced Mandela to his social circle.
We established sort of a natural relationship because, I didn't particularly distinguish between black and white because at the time I was a member of the Communist Party and I had black friends and I had Indian friends and I had Chinese friends, and we used to socialize. It was unusual at the time, but as far as I was concerned, I didn't think it was unnatural to have a black friend or an Indian friend or a Chinese friend.
As liberal as the law firm was there, I believe that Nelson Mandela did experience some instances of racial discrimination. There was that story about the teacups when the secretary would let him drink only from the ones that had been reserved for black members of the firm.
Yeah, then as in our offices right throughout the country, there was a place for blacks and a place for whites, and there was very little, interaction between the black staff and the white staff. They even they're supposed to have their own cups and things like that. Although Miss Lieberman, who was in working at the time, said that she'd got new cups and everybody was supposed to drink black and white, but it wasn't really the case.
Like any good communist, Bregman tried to recruit new members to the party. But when it came to Mandela, politics per se was then a hard sell.
He was only interested in getting through his exams. He was not interested in politics at all. He had an open mind, but I would think that he was a very conservative person as far as politics is concerned. I don't think he had any interest in politics at all at that time.
Despite this, Bregman remembers a seemingly casual but prophetic remark by Mandela.
Don't ask me when or how or in what circumstances this happened. If you see Nelson, ask him. But one day he leaned back in his chair. You know, Nat, he said, one day I'm going to be Prime Minister of this country.
With a regular job now, Mandela started taking on the trappings of an urban African. He rented this room in a yard in Alexandra, known then as Dark City, because of the complete absence of electricity. For the first time in his life, Mandela had to fend for himself. Like most other black professionals, he was paid miserably. He'd go without meals and frequently walk to work in the city centre to save on bus fare. When the bus company hiked fares by a penny in the early 1940s, the residents of Alexandra retaliated with a boycott. Mandela took part in a march in support of the boycott, for the first time moving from observer to participant, as he would later remark. The bus company caved into the pressure and scrapped the fare increase. The role of mass action in forcing the bus company's hand made a lasting impression on Mandela. This is Mandela with his classmates from law school at the University of the Witwatersrand in the 1940s. It's the official photo of their reunion in 1996. Mandela enrolled at WITS, as it's known, after completing his Bachelor of Arts degree by correspondence. Advocate Jules Brody would probably scoff if you suggested he was a radical in his student days. But he befriended Mandela at WITS at a time when any fraternization between blacks and whites made heads turn.
There was no mixing of colours at WITS. People, we used to sit with Mandela and talk to him about what we thought could be the future of South Africa, hopefully. And those of us who did that were looked upon as rather strange that we should make a friend of the black chaps. There were plenty of white people you could be friends with. Why did you have to be friends with the black people? That was an attitude, even at WITS.
Although WITS prided itself on being a liberal university and allowed black students to study here, in reality they never felt comfortable. In fact, Nelson Mandela's law professor even had the temerity to suggest that African and women students weren't sufficiently disciplined to master the intricacies of law.
We had a professor by the name of Harlow who lectured to us on the law of persons. And one day he was very nasty about an essay that Mandela had written as part of a project that we all had to do. And he said, "You call this an essay?" And very nastily spoke about it. And when he walked away, Mandela turned to me and he said, "I only wish that fellow had to write an essay by oil lamp in Sapphire Town at night." He said, "I don't think he would find it quite as easy as he makes it out to be."
In a way, Mandela may have reinforced his law professor's prejudices. His studies were squeezed in between his work as a clerk in Sadelsky's law firm, and after 6 years at WITS, he left without his LLB degree. But Mandela was being drawn increasingly into the political fray. At university, at work, and through friends like Walter Sisulu, he was continually meeting people who were seething about the racial injustices. If you had a black skin, Johannesburg was a hostile place to be.
It was terrible. It was terrible, my dear, really, because there were areas where you are not supposed to go. In town.
You couldn't be in a white area after 9 o'clock at night. You had to leave town by 9 o'clock. It's the last bus that leaves town for the township. If you miss that, that means it's either you're going to end up in prison, or you sleep in the street or walk to your home.
Being from the Transkei, where everybody is free, to me it looked like a prison to us. It's Johannesburg.
This is Vilakazi Street in Soweto. Very famous street because it was home to 2 Nobel Peace Prize winners. Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who lived in the house behind the grey wall just there, and just a little further up the road, Nelson Mandela, of course. The residents apparently nicknamed this area Westcliff after the fancy white suburb to the north. A very ironic sense of humour because this area looked nothing like Westcliff.
Mandela's house is in a part of Soweto known as Orlando. When Johannesburg was being shaped as an apartheid city in the 1930s, Spartan houses, dubbed matchboxes, were being built here en masse. One was allocated to Mandela when his first wife, Evelyn, was expecting a baby. They had 4 children, one of whom died as an infant.
Number 8115, Orlando West, was typical of the box houses that dominated in this area. But it was Mandela's home. He says he enjoyed the domesticity of the place, bathing his children and playing with them, relaxing, smelling home cooking. But he was seldom here to enjoy those things.
Walter and Albertina Sisulu lived close by. Their houses changed a lot over the years. The high gate and fence now make it difficult to get a good look. But for Mandela, it was home from home.
Nelson was a frequent visit because he was loved so much being a young boy by Walter. And he used to visit us quite often with other boys.
Anton Limberdi, one of the few black lawyers in South Africa at the time, also dropped in regularly. He argued passionately that Africa was the black man's continent, and it was up to Africans to reclaim what was rightfully theirs. The raw nationalism struck a chord with Mandela, and he became increasingly committed to ANC politics. But Albertina Sisulu wasn't sure whether this was such a good thing. Her motherly instincts told her Mandela needed to first finish studying.
And in fact, my fear was that he was still a student. I didn't want him to be, interested in politics at that time, before he is through with his courses.
But as politics started to eclipse Walter Sisulu's business career, Albertina could see the benefit of having Mandela around.
All we wanted now is freedom for all of us. If you speak about freedom, then that's what we would love. Nelson, when he was quite often in my house, I was very happy because now Walter has got somebody to help him.
There's a comfortable-looking house on the edge of Sophiatown. You probably wouldn't give it a second glance if you passed by. But so much history has happened in it and around it. It's now the home of a medical doctor, as it was half a century ago. Dr. Bolam Baya wants to preserve things much as they were when the remarkable Dr. Alfred Drum lived here.
I won't like to change much, especially inside the house. I won't like to change much. I might improve it a bit just to make it according to my taste, but I won't change much, I must say.
Dr. Drum started out as a herd boy, but went on to become a surgeon, even practicing abroad. After returning to South Africa, he took over the leadership of the ANC, pumping new life into an organization virtually dying on its feet. Mandela and his political friends were regular visitors to Drum's Sophiatown home. But they were frustrated with his rather cordial way of dealing with the government. They told Drum they wanted to form a youth league to press the ANC into the kind of mass action which had been so successful in the Alexandra bus boycott. When this photo was taken, Drum was probably unaware that Mandela, there on the left, was part of a conspiracy to depose him as ANC president. Drab on the outside, but this is where the black elite in Mandela's day got together for some fun. It was the venue for plays and concerts, dances and weddings. But as blacks were increasingly forced out of the city, its purpose as a social hub became obsolete.
Like many buildings of its generation in Johannesburg, the Bantu Men's Social Centre was altered over the years. Here's a doorway that was partially bricked up. It was probably once a grand entrance that Nelson Mandela got to know fairly well. And over here is the cornerstone that was unveiled when the Bantu Men's Social Centre was built in 1924.
20 years later, it's where the ANC Youth League was formally launched with a series of rousing speeches. The angry young men who signed this document, Mandela included, saw themselves as the ANC's powerhouse, who'd give force, direction and vigour to the struggle for African national freedom. With the Second World War drawing to an end, the time seemed ripe for change. Hitler's defeat by the Allied forces had given rise to hopes of a new, more enlightened world order. South Africa's wartime leader, General Jan Smuts, was lauded for his part in helping to crush Nazi tyranny. Mandela and his fellow youth leaguers hoped this would mean change back home. But the violent suppression of the mine workers' strike in 1946 and new laws to hobble the country's Indian community quickly doused their hopes. Then Dr. D.F. Malan's National Party won the 1948 election with promises to further separate the races and build an Afrikaner state.
You begin to find signs, apartheid signs, which we did not have before 1948. There were no signs before 1948. It was only after the Afrikaner government came into power that we begin to see signs on walls that said whites, blacks, coloreds, Indians only.
You felt that, no, those were things that happened in Germany. Those were not things that happened in South Africa. We can't, that couldn't happen. The people will not allow that to happen.
The word apartheid had not yet been used, but the laws that were proposed at that time were absolutely frightening. And a lot of us at university, I was at Fort Hare then, got together and said there has to be a response.
It may come as a bit of a surprise to feature the Voortrekker Monument in a program about Nelson Mandela. But at the very time the ANC was holding a landmark conference in Bloemfontein, at which Nelson Mandela and fellow radicals were engineering the takeover of the organization, the South African media was preoccupied with the official opening of this monument. Understandable possibly because 100,000 Afrikaners had gathered here to witness the event.
The Afrikaner nationalists were effectively congratulating themselves for winning the election the year before. The Prime Minister, Dr. D.F. Malan, declared their hour had come, just as a shaft of sunlight, through clever design, passed across the shrine at the base of the monument. The ANC Youth Leaguers were savouring their own victory, several hundred kilometres away at the Makeba Hall outside Bloemfontein. At a crunch meeting here, Alfred Duma, the man who was accused of yielding to oppression, was forced to resign as ANC president. In his place, the Youth Leaguers installed their own nominee, James Moroka. Their coup had succeeded.
1949, I was in Bloemfontein when the ANC Youth League, under the leadership of men like Oliver Tambo, Nelson Mandela, A.P. Mda, went to Bloemfontein and said to the ANC, "You've had a program of opposition to white rule, which we reckon is ineffective." We came up, you'll recall, with the famous program of action, where the Youth League insisted that the mother body take off his gloves and begin to fight for our freedom.
Mandela, like his fellow Youth Leaguers, was spoiling for a fight. He was among the hardliners who, initially, spent much of their energies opposing collaboration with communists and radicals from other race groups. Amina Kachalia, who with her late husband Yusuf was active in the South African Indian Congress, remembers being given the brush off.
I don't think they trusted the Indians at the time. At least Nelson didn't. And he admitted that. He felt that they perhaps weren't serious enough to take on the Africans as well, to have a national struggle, national liberation struggle.
But Mandela's stubbornness aside, Amina Kachalia took a liking to the young man who was moving quickly up the ANC's political ranks.
He was very impressive from the word go, in a sense. I kind of liked him. He was good looking and he was friendly and he was very attentive, and I think one sort of had a slight chemistry even.
Ahmed Kathrada also became one of Mandela's lifelong friends and political allies. But their relationship also had a rocky start. Kathrada was an Indian and communist.
Johannesburg's Commissioner Street was the scene of an early row between Nelson Mandela and Ahmed Kathrada. The ANC Youth League was refusing to support a May Day strike in 1950, called in protest against government plans to ban the Communist Party. Kathrada, who was much younger than Nelson Mandela, wanted to know why the ANC Youth League was against the strike.
It was only in the preparation for the strike, which they opposed, and we were working for the strike, that we met up in the street just by accident. And after the first pleasantries, we started discussing the strike. And that is where I was tactless to challenge him, that you're an African and I'm an Indian, but I challenge you to choose or select a township of your choice among your people. And I challenge you that I'll beat you, because the masses are with us.
Mandela's fondness for boxing boosted his image as an increasingly tough political operator. He heckled and pulled speakers from platforms when he didn't agree with them. Amina Kachalia's husband, Yusuf, no small man himself, was apparently dragged from a podium by Mandela.
I was not married at the time to Yusuf. I did, of course, ask him about it many years later. And he says, yeah, there was a skirmish and Nelson wouldn't let me speak or something. But one of his other friends said, no, he definitely pulled him off the platform when he was about to speak.
But the only punches Mandela ever really threw were here at the Donaldson Orlando Community Centre in Soweto. He used to work out here in a makeshift gym most weekday evenings. Mandela lacked the speed and power to be anything more than an enthusiastic amateur, but he was more interested in the training. He He said it was a way of losing himself in something that wasn't the struggle.
Mandela was typically modest about his boxing abilities, but this is where he'd come to sharpen his skills, often with his son Thembekile. There was no ring, and sparring sessions would take place on the concrete floor, which could be quite dangerous if a boxer was felled by a punch.
For many blacks, boxing became a symbol of their ability to fight back. Mandela also used the sport as a political metaphor. He remarked later, when you're circling your opponent, probing his strengths and weaknesses, you're not thinking about his colour or social status. This sort of thinking allowed him to concentrate on strategy and, like any good fighter, change tactics when necessary. The support given by African workers to the 1950 May Day strike and the ruthlessness of the police convinced Mandela that he and the Youth League had badly miscalculated.
In spite of what the Youth League did, in the face of their opposition, it took place. It was very successful.
Ahmed Kathrada's flat in Colvard House near Johannesburg's old business district was a meeting place for an assortment of political activists. Realizing the need for joint action against the apartheid enemy, Mandela became a more frequent visitor. From this point on, he started pushing inclusiveness, as though he had supported it all along.
I think it was a realization, yes, pragmatic, of course, but I think a realization that even the policy of the African National Congress, although they were separate organizations, the policy of the organizations of the oppressed people all pointed towards cooperation. Why should the oppressed people fight these things alone, separately?
So when was Colvard House actually built?
It was built it was completed in 1942.
1942?
Yeah.
And this is flat number 13?
That's flat number 13. That's where Kathy was.
Ahmed Kathrada's apartment in Colvard House was flat 13. Looking back, Mandela said it was here that the first seeds of non-racialism were sown and a wider concept of the nation came into being. A place of obvious historic importance, but the caretaker of Colvard House, Ahmed Podshi, says it's been standing empty for years.
Bit of South African history here behind this iron grille gate.
Lots, I think. Because as I heard that Mandela also used to come here, quite a lot of other top personalities always used to come here.
Well, I moved in there in 1947, and right up to the time of when I went underground in 1963, that became a center of a lot of activity, formal and informal.
Given its location in downtown Johannesburg, was it not an easy target for the police to keep under surveillance?
Oh, they used to raid it quite often.
Shopkeeper Salim Nanabai was Kathrada's neighbor for years. With tongue-in-cheek, he tells of the inconvenience of having a political hothead next door.
There were times when he was, he was placed under house arrest. He couldn't go out. We had continuous raids by the police, the so-called special branch there, you see. And they used to come there in the middle of the night, try to break down his door. They want to check who is in the house. At that time, he could have contact with other people.
We're on the roof of Colvard House. Photographs were taken of Nelson Mandela, Ahmed Kathrada and other activists up here to probably catch a bit of sunlight after plotting revolution down below.
The Defiance campaign of 1952 might not have had the fire and brimstone of traditional revolution, but it was the kind of action the Youth Leaguers had been agitating for. A letter was sent to D.F. Milan voicing the ANC's frustration at the exclusion of the majority of the population from the country's political life and demanding the repeal of the main discriminatory laws. But Milan brushed it aside. Mandela said this was like a declaration of war.
The Defiance campaign was to begin for our people, to begin to fight the evil in our own country and in our system, to fight against the laws that were against the people.
It was intended to be non-violent. We simply went out to defy the laws, the past laws. You remember people went out to burn their passes, to leave their passes at home, to break the curfew laws which require that in urban areas blacks should be indoors by 9 p.m. So we went out deliberately to be arrested.
The defiance campaign meant that we are going to break the laws of the country. We are going, of course, to be arrested. We are going to jail. Even if the magistrate were to impose the minimum fine, you mustn't pay. You must go to jail.
Mandela was named volunteer-in-chief, responsible for recruiting people to take part in the Defiance campaign. It wasn't easy, as Nkosi Drum recalls.
At that stage, in 1952, I was the Transvaal Organizing Secretary of the African National Congress Youth League. And one of my duties was to go all over the Transvaal, especially Gauteng, organizing youngsters. I recall so very clearly, I used to get so irritated on Sunday afternoons when my comrades, my colleagues, my age group, went to watch Swallows play against Pirates. And I would say to them, to hell with you, man.
Raymond Makeba looking suitably grim, but this was just a gag to raise money for charity. Makeba led the first protest in the Defiance campaign and was promptly arrested. Here he is, wearing a balaclava with his fellow defiers, attempting to cross a whites-only threshold at a railway station in Port Elizabeth. Civil disobedience was then viewed as a crime, not a political protest.
The people in Port Elizabeth, I suppose even throughout the country, believed that we were going to be shot as we were breaking the law. The government organized police above the rank of a sergeant up, not below, to handle that situation. We defied at the railway station in New Brighton. In those days, you'll have Europeans on the entrance, non-Europeans entrance. We went to the European entrance.
Here's Mandela trying to hand a letter to the magistrates in Boksburg, east of Johannesburg, on the day the Defiance campaign started. That night he was arrested and had his first taste of jail. The Defiance campaign petered out after the authorities introduced harsh new measures to deal with dissenters. But the ANC had shown it was able to organize nationally. Mandela took much of the credit.
We felt that the state could be challenged, could be taken on. I mean, for black South Africans to go out deliberately, to break the laws, to leave their passbooks at home, to be out in the street at 9 p.m. is the kind of thing that had never happened in this country. And it's the effect on the mindset of our people that is so fundamental.
The membership of the African National Congress, for instance, shot up from, I think, 10 or 20,000 to 100,000 just during that Defiance campaign. And apart from the membership itself, among the ordinary people, it became conscious for the first time, as far as the Africans were concerned, there was this campaign where hundreds and thousands of people were courting imprisonment.
It was a complete breakthrough, and it was also a breakthrough for the Indian Congress because they now could work together with the African National Congress.
Half a century on, Chancellor House in downtown Johannesburg still provides shelter for the dejected and downtrodden. Squatters now live where Nelson Mandela and Oliver Tambo set up the only black-owned law firm in the country. Throughout the 1950s, the corridors and stairwells were overflowing with desperate victims of the apartheid system, people who had violated laws that applied only to blacks. Mandela said he believed his law firm was a place where ordinary Africans could find a sympathetic ear and competent ally. He said it was why he had become a lawyer in the first place.
They were a very popular firm because they were good. They were interested in the cases of their people. And they knew what it meant to be accused of what those people were accused of.
But Ruth Mompati didn't find Mandela the easiest of bosses. He'd be dismissive when she helpfully offered advice on some of the wording in letters.
If he thought he was right, insisted that that's how it should be. But at times I would go and type the letter and bring it back. And he would look at it and say, no, I think you were right.
The words Mandela and Tambo were painted up there for all to see. Apparently, it irritated conservative members of the legal profession. But in a way, it matched Mandela's growing confidence and flamboyance. Whenever he entered a courtroom, he'd make his presence felt. Oliver Tambo was much quieter and tended to stay in the office doing the paperwork.
Judge Fikile Bam used to work on Saturday mornings at Mandela and Tambo when he was contemplating a career in the legal world. He noticed how people were prepared to wait endlessly just to see Mandela.
He had a large following. There was always a queue outside his office. People wanted to be represented, especially by him. And that's because I think of his showman style. He used a great performer in court, in criminal cases and so on, and a good cross-examiner. And because of that, a lot of his office work, you might say, the desk work, got to be done by other people, particularly by Tambo.
Mandela was also admired because he refused to act in the humble manner expected of blacks at the time.
Most other black lawyers at the time were, they tended to be very abject before the magistrate and to be almost apologetic, when they have to make submissions to magistrates. And that Mandela broke through that completely, and he was really one of the first people and not to have this abject attitude towards magistrate, but to be very firm and almost go the other way, extreme, of being defiant when, the need arose.
The Mandela and Tambo law firm was situated conveniently opposite the Johannesburg Magistrates Court. But rather than representing clients, Mandela found himself increasingly on the receiving end of the legal machinery. By now, he was almost permanently banned from holding any elected office and forbidden to make public speeches. The apartheid state did its best to erase Sophiatown in 1954, but there's still some rubble, all these years later, from the buildings that were flattened, a stubborn reminder of what was once one of South Africa's most vibrant African communities. One resident is said to have hanged himself from this oak tree when faced with eviction. Sophiatown was one of the very few areas where black people could own freehold property. With the growth of Johannesburg, it became encircled by white suburbs and was simply too close for comfort. The photographer, Peter Magubani, was among those who were thrown out.
I felt that these people were stealing from us. But there was no way to fight back. The only way to do was to fight with my camera, use my camera as an instrument. Use my camera to document what is happening, supply the world with the material, show the world how apartheid operates. When we woke up in the morning, Sophiatown was red, meaning it was just white people, white policemen and white soldiers in Sophiatown, trucks and everything. So we knew that that was the day that, even if you tried to resist, you wouldn't resist. They'd overrun you.
The forced removals from Sophiatown presented an open political challenge to Nelson Mandela. In between banning orders, he addressed a meeting in Sophiatown's Freedom Square, now a school playing field. Watched by police, Mandela, a self-confessed rabble-rouser, told the angry crowd to prepare before long to use violence. Despite being admonished by the ANC's national executive for advocating a radical departure from policy, it was apparent that Mandela had become impatient with non-violent methods of protest.
At that stage, we were not listening so much to the content of what he was saying, but rather the sort of force with which he would castigate the system and castigate apartheid and the police and so on.
The lights in the Old Planet Hotel used to burn late into the night. It was one of the most popular dance venues in Johannesburg for black patrons, a chance to escape their troubles before stepping back into the street outside. By the mid-1950s, the nationalists were extending apartheid at an alarming pace. Little in a black person's life was left untouched, and it didn't matter who you were.
We needed to have permits to go through the white cities of South Africa. If you did not have a permit, which is signed by your employer who is white, then you would go to jail. So it was very, very difficult. And all the white people who wanted to work with us also had a problem because they could not be seen working with us on stage. Sometimes we would go to their homes off stage, and if we are raided, they are raided, and we would have to explain why we were there, blacks and whites together.
Lewis Nkosi, one of the great drum writers from the 1950s, paid a heavy price when he forgot his passbook in the office. Nkosi was a despised breed for the police at the time, black and a journalist.
We got beaten up in the prison, I mean not the prison, but the police station, interrogated, beaten up. And I was telling them, listen, I worked just across the road there, and you picked me up for no reason at all. You ring up my editor. In the end, they rang up my editor, who vouched that I did exist.
You could be stepping back into the 1950s in this part of Kliptown in Soweto. It's where the Freedom Charter was launched in June 1955. More than 3,000 people, predominantly black, but including whites, coloureds and Indians, took part. The idea was to create a set of principles for the foundation of a free South Africa. Demands were submitted from all over the country.
The organization that went into it, where hundreds of volunteers went house to house before the Congress of the People, collecting demands. They went to the factories with factory meetings, they went to houses, they went to community organizations, addressed them, collecting demands. So literally thousands of demands came on pieces of paper. And that eventually led to the drawing up of the Freedom Charter.
The Freedom Charter started long before, when we had to work from street to street. You know, we had a plan which came from Nelson Mandela himself. We called it the M plan, the Mandela plan, where because of the harassment, we had to have units of 10 to work with. We organized a unit, you organize the next unit. And that's how we organized the preparations for the Freedom Charter. And when we went to launch, all the work had been done.
The Freedom Charter came about as a result of these thousands of demands that people had made in their individual capacities and as well as the community organizations to which they belong. So they felt involved. It wasn't something that came from on top. It was something they felt was their own.
Nelson Mandela was under another banning order when the Freedom Charter was launched, but he drove to Kliptown with Walter Sisulu and watched proceedings from a distance. When the police eventually moved in, armed with Sten guns, and took down the name of everybody present, Mandela realized it signaled a harsh new turn by the authorities.
The Freedom Charter committed the ANC to widening the basis of the struggle. But not all ANC members agreed with this. Some of the more radical Africanists objected to the first clause: the land belongs to all who live in it, black and white. After fierce debate, the ANC eventually approved the charter, but deep divisions over the role of other races and organizations in the struggle remained.
One of the reasons why a lot of ANC youth leaguers rejected the Freedom Charter was that it was written by the Communist Party, it was not written by Z.K. Matthews. I've never entered that debate because I'm not quite sure how and who actually penned the Freedom Charter. But I'm just saying, these are some of the objections that young blacks had about the role of the privileged communists who were mainly Indian and white.
The communists were also suspected by the government of being the main instigators behind the growing resistance to apartheid. Ever since the Freedom Charter launch at Kliptown, there were ominous warnings of mass arrests. It happened at the end of 1956. Nelson Mandela was among scores of leaders of all races charged with high treason. They were taken to the fort on a hill overlooking Johannesburg. Mandela knew the place well. As a lawyer, he'd been there often to help fellow blacks.
You must remember that my firm with Oliver Tambo was the only African firm for a long time, and therefore we were inundated with various requests to appeal for clients, and we therefore came very often here.
But as an inmate, Mandela was subjected to a special humiliation reserved for blacks. They were made to strip naked on admission.
Humiliation for blacks, especially Africans, by whites, was not something strange. It happened in various forms throughout our lives. But actually to be stripped naked in the presence of others, not only blacks, but the white warders, was a particular kind of humiliation.
After starting at the drill hall in Johannesburg, the treason trial was shifted to the old synagogue in Pretoria. The prosecution argued that the accused had conspired to overthrow the government by violence and replace it with a communist state. The charge was based on speeches and statements by the accused during the previous 4 years, from the Defiance Campaign to the Sophiatown protests and the Freedom Charter.
The state said this is violent revolution on Marxist grounds, right? And Marxist theory. They said, oh, the ANC is being driven by white communists whose objective is armed revolution, violent overthrow, etc., you know. And all of us sitting there just laughed. It was nonsense.
Our people were being accused because they were doing what they were doing. They were being accused in order to intimidate them from carrying on with the struggle.
We used to meet for lunch, all of us went for lunch in the church grounds in Pretoria. And at one stage, people were saying, let's get ready. The gallows are not far away.
Mandela's calm confidence throughout the trial buoyed the spirits of his co-accused. His testimony showed how committed he was to their cause.
Nelson Mandela was already a great leader at that time, and everyone looked upon him as the future leader of this country. So it was wonderful to sit there and listen to him talk and inspire everybody.
You only have to look at the treason trial photograph and who stands out but Mandela. And not just because he's tall, he's not all that tall, but because of his posture, his style, his manner, his self-confidence, a certain royalty about him. So we all knew that this was somebody very special.
But even Mandela despaired about the length of the trial. He believed it was a stitch-up intended to put anti-apartheid leaders out of action for years. The once thriving law practice he shared with Oliver Tambo started falling apart.
There was a time when I used to start work at 6 in the morning and knock off at 2. So that at 6 he would give me dictation and give me work, and then I would start working. When they left, I think they left before 8 for Pretoria, and then I would remain working.
Amina Kachalia often brought a plate of food to Mandela in the evenings, while he was trying to get on top of the law firm's backlog of work.
I would just go along and take him something. And he was usually alone with somebody there and the police. Police were downstairs at the entrance, and they were upstairs in his office. They were always there watching what he was doing and so on.
Despite the difficulties of a complex and marathon trial, Mandela still found time to court a beautiful young social worker, Winnie Nomzamo Madikizela. His marriage to Evelyn had fallen apart during the 1950s. Evelyn felt Mandela had abandoned her and the family for politics.
She was a nurse and she had to work and she had to see to the kids and she had to have the money to keep the home fires burning. Nelson didn't have that money, he couldn't support her and the children. And perhaps that was one reason too, that she just had had enough.
Winnie, with her stunning good looks, was an obvious catch for Mandela. But his close friends were surprised at first with his choice.
She had just come from the Transkei, from Ponderland, and she was quiet, yes. She never had too much to say at that stage. She was very conscious of clothes and dressing and so on. But other than that, she wasn't really political. He probably just looked at her and loved her for her looks at the beginning, but probably as he got to know her, realized that there was something much deeper in Winnie.
Ruth Mompati was among a small group of friends who travelled to the wedding at Winnie's family home in the Transkei.
As you can see, this is a photograph of Nelson Mandela's wedding to Winnie Mandela, Winnie Madikizela as she was then. And there you are seated on the left-hand side of Nelson Mandela. What sort of memories does this photograph bring back to you?
Well, this was a very happy marriage. It was a very happy day. As you see, it was a formal wedding with a good number of Nelson's friends there. There's Hamel, I think that's Hamel's wife.
Michael Hamel, the communist.
Yes. Oh, no, Michael Hamel, Nelson's friend, not the communist. Communist was the organization that he belonged to, but he wasn't representing the Communist Party there. Right. He went there as one of Nelson's friends. And if I'm not making a mistake, that's Hamel's daughter. I may be wrong. And then there's Nelson's sister. There's a friend of Winnie's. Celebrations were the same as a celebration in any wedding. But it was, it didn't become a political wedding. It was just an ordinary wedding. And a very beautiful wedding too, because Winnie Mandela is a very beautiful woman.
The wedding must have been a wonderful but frustratingly brief interlude for Nelson Mandela. In no time it was back to the treason trial and a growing political crisis within the ANC, which came to a head here at the Orlando Hall in Soweto. The Africanists within the ANC bitterly resented growing collaboration with communists and other races and formed the breakaway Pan-Africanist Congress under the leadership of Robert Sobukwe.
The debate began to focus on the role of the Communist Party within the Youth League, within the ANC, led by Mangaliso Sobukwe, Potako Lebalo, and all those boys. They used to meet incidentally in my consulting rooms in Orlando West. And we had these heated debates about whether the PAC had not been formed then, whether in fact the nationalists within the ANC, within the Youth League, should break away. And I always advised against it. I said to Mangaliso Sobukwe, who was my patient incidentally, he suffered from chest problems, that we would weaken the fight against apartheid if the PAC was to break away. Unfortunately, the guys were so determined that the PAC broke away in 1959.
The PAC quickly showed its mettle, shrewdly overtaking the ANC's plans for a big anti-pass campaign by quickly organizing its own. On the 21st of March 1960, in response to the PAC's call, several thousand people gathered outside the Sharpeville police station, demanding to hand in their passes and be arrested. There was a scuffle at the fence surrounding the police station, and without warning, the police opened fire. Although the crowd scattered, the police carried on shooting. When it was over, 69 people were dead and nearly 200 injured. Ahmed Kathrada remembers hearing the appalling news while still on trial for treason.
Chief Lutuli was giving evidence for the defense, and at tea time we heard of these killings. Now it was quite incongruous. Here was Chief Luthuli expounding on ANC policy of non-violence, and 100 miles from Pretoria, 69 peaceful people were killed.
The drum writer Lewis Nkosi, who was sent by his editor to cover the Sharpeville protest, is still haunted by the events of that day.
There were bodies heaped on top of each other, and some of those bodies were still alive. You could see the eyes of people, blinking, like, help me, but you couldn't do anything.
That immediately set people thinking, are we still right in continuing with this policy of peaceful protest and peaceful campaigns? Mr. Mandela, most of all, had started, well, he hadn't just started thinking that way, but this sort of propelled him further into thinking that it's necessary to change.
Just over a year later, the treason trial ended with a not guilty verdict. Some of the courtroom euphoria was captured on a cine camera, which had been smuggled in. The three judges who presided over the treason trial here at the old synagogue in Pretoria said it was impossible to come to the conclusion that the ANC had been planning to overthrow the state by force, nor had the prosecution been able to prove that the ANC or the Freedom Charter were communist. The accused gathered out here to sing Nkosi Africa. The defense lawyers were hoisted shoulder high, but there was no time for Mandela to celebrate. In the aftermath of Sharpeville, the ANC and other political organizations had been banned. Instead of returning home, Mandela went underground to launch an armed struggle.